Okay, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
All right, so feels like a long time since the last one. So this is part 4 of a 5-part series on why do we need to talk about racism. And so we had a 2-week gap because of the meeting, and then that went the whole time, and then last weekend, Gail and I were traveling in Minnesota to a wedding. So I was pleased that we're able to get a couple of Sundays where we could come back to this. So do a little quick review here. We're focusing our discussion each time around the overt covert racism pyramid, and focusing on the covert pieces, because these are the types of things that we all tend to participate in, whether it's intentional or unintentional, but they have just as much of a negative effect, if not more, because they contribute to the systemic racism. And many of these are considered microaggressions. The last session we were together, we discussed these 3 elements of covert racism. I don't see color, tone policing, and my intention was not racist. And if you weren't able to be here for the last session, the details of these elements are posted on Realm. What I've asked you to do each time, and we're going to really visit these in more detail. So we opened up in the opening session, threw out some questions for table discussion. What is racism? In your words, and then does racism exist in our communities, schools, and country? Because there are a lot of people that don't think it exists anymore. Why is it important to talk about racism? So we're going to come back and have in our last session, have some discussion about these after having gone through our series, and see if our thoughts have changed at all in what we think. And then we're also going to have some discussions. Okay, what do we do moving forward? During table discussions, you're encouraged to share openly. No judgment. We know that everybody is in a different place and in their individual place related to these topics. So please share openly. Share experiences that you have. Share things that you've witnessed or thoughts that you have, because I think we can all learn from each other that way. It's okay to have differing ideas and thoughts. Try to listen not to correct or argue, but to listen for learning and understanding. And then during your discussions at a table, give everybody a chance to share, so that we can hear everyone's voice. And then at your table, you're going to have one of the elements that we're going to talk about today. So once we start the discussion, each of you read the description, kind of ponder it personally, and then talk about. These are some things that you might talk about. You don't have to talk about all of these things. You might go in a different direction, but some of the things you could talk about are, what's your reaction? Can you think of media or historical examples of the element that you have at your table? What are some of your personal experiences? In the first 3 sessions, people I thought did a really good job of sharing some of their personal experiences, and that's really, I think, personal stories help us learn and reflect the best, so that's really good. And I think people have been really open and honest. And then maybe talk about why might this be an issue or problematic. And so these are some things you might talk about. The three elements that we're going to look at today are fear of people of color, disbelieving experiences of people of color, and then denying white privilege. And so you'll have about 15 minutes for discussion at your table, and then we'll kind of come back together as a large group and have you share some of the highlights of the discussion that took place. And then I have a few videos related to each of these elements that we'll take a look at, I think kind of help us do a good job of, or help us with our reflection and thought related to it. So I'll set the 15-minute timer, and you can go ahead and begin your discussion. And if you're at a table by yourself, maybe we can. Okay.
A lot of different situations.
So that calls for us to look out for
All right, so heard some really good, deep conversations going on, and as I'm sure you found out in discussing this, it's not any simple black or white issue. In some cases it's real clear what's going on, and in some cases it's kind of a gray area. So we'll start out with fear of people of color. I think only one table ended up having that because
That's us.
we didn't.
We did.
Oh, two people, okay. So, would you guys like to, would your table like to start as far as the other table over there?
Okay.
Wasn't pointing, oh, it's pointing over your head. So, Diane's table, you guys want to share some of the highlights of what you talked about, or something that you think is important to share with the group?
Both Gail and Carol had great stories to share, and I don't know if they want. We'll just put the hospital.
Yeah,
And try to speak up a
I
little
can
bit.
only speak for St. Luke's, but due to the violence, and I am really sad, I mean, it breaks my heart to say, but it's, the majority of it is within the Black community, due to the gun violence, particularly when, that person or the results of altercations or fights, or to bring people to the emergency room. St. Luke's always had a lockdown policy, before. They always had that, but it wasn't used very much. But, now they have, changed that due to that when this happens, often, and that's when they call a lockdown, the community of that person, and sometimes the community of the person that did the shooting or whatever, the two communities follow them to the hospital. They're worried about them, they want to know what's going on. And the number of people is a problem, but sometimes the problem is because in that anxiety and height of fear and anxiety that's going on with the community, they are not sometimes listening to the health personnel, so breaking into exam rooms, pushing into the X-ray to learn what's going on or to see how that person is being treated before they know. And that led to an unsafe environment, or where people felt unsafe, unmanaged environment. And so now, the lockdowns are called just like that to prevent. So that's a difference. And I know if that patient moves up to ICU and is a tenuous condition because that's next to the area where I work, naturally there's a lot of people in the waiting room because this person may die tragically. And as long as behavior's okay, I mean, that's a normal thing. So it was, I think, because staff was feeling unsafe, and staff has felt unsafe regardless of color, and I don't know how much of this is due to experience and feeling threatened or feeling unsafe, and how much is due to racism there, but it is a precarious situation, so, but it saddens me a lot that, it seems to be mostly the Black community that's having that violence, so, and so then we call lockdowns our Black communities, so, yeah.
What is the issue you have on your thing here? I didn't get that in the first place.
Fear of people of color, so
Oh.
is it,
I just heard people of color and okay.
yeah, fear, and that's,
Thank you for mentioning that, Jonathan. I should just read these. So, fear of people of color. A group called the Perception Institute cites research about the phenomena of racial anxiety, which refers to the heightened levels of stress and emotion that human beings may experience when interacting with people of other races. It impacts people of color who may worry they will be the subject of discrimination and hostility. White people, meanwhile, worry that they will be assumed to be racist, or that people of color, unless restrained, policed, and segregated, will mistreat white people as revenge for the way whites have treated people of color. Further, white people have been taught subliminally to fear other African Americans and other people of color. This causes a kind of feedback loop where their everyday interactions reinforce the fears and anxieties of both white people and people of color. So I'll read those at the beginning. So one of the things I'm wondering as I'm hearing you share that story is that always these things are really complicated, and one of the things that makes me wonder is with where you talked about people or relatives trying to force their way into rooms and things, and it makes me wonder, does some of that have to do with the historical fear of the medical field
yeah,
and the difference in treatment? So
they are telling
yeah,
us, they are telling
yeah.
us.
And that may be either conscious or unconscious, but unconscious or unconscious. Anybody else have?
So I was relating an experience of this week. I had an appointment downtown, parked my car, and was headed into the building. And about a half a block from the building, and a young black man riding a bicycle, not particularly well dressed, was coming toward me. And so I made eye contact and said, "Hi, how are you?" or something beautiful day, something along those lines. And proceeded to walk on, and he circled around and said, ma'am, can I ask you a question? Can I ask you a question? And with that, I simply walked faster and said, I'm in a rush, I need to get in, and headed for the building and went in. Internally, I felt relief that I had avoided any kind of interaction. But the question I asked myself is, would I have felt the same way had it been a white guy dressed the same way, riding a bike, pursuing me in the same way? I think the answer is yes, I would have. So what's racist and what's wise fear for an older white woman by herself on the streets? You know, how do you put that together?
I think one of the things maybe is the key there is, to me, just my thought, is that you took time to reflect on it. So what was, you reflected, was what I did, covert racism, was it because of my, and probably some elements were, because one of the things that happens with the violent thing is the acts of violence of people of color get reported like crazy. And so that's what those of us who aren't part of that community get bombarded with. And we're not hearing the positive stories. And if we're not building relationships with people of color and having positive experiences with people of color, then no matter how hard we work, that constant bombardment by the media of associating acts of violence or criminal acts is going to affect us. Because the reality is there are just as many white people committing those kinds of acts, but it seems to get played up more when it's people of color. So you guys want to share some things? You had the same, yeah.
Well, Carol touched me there very much, because that whole idea, I have people yelling at me all the time, because I'm always out alone. And I go all kinds of weird places. And you need to be careful and you need to be aware, and as a female, that is something women, we all know that when you're out there, learn how to carry your keys, etc. And I love the way Carol put that, reflecting on it afterwards, is why, I'm the type, honestly, working with this sort of thing, I may make extra effort if I see the black guy coming on the bike, to make a chance to say hi and interact. But if it was a not so well dressed, dirty white guy, I'd probably get the heck out of the way and be more frightened. The perceptions are different, but yes, in this day and age too, I wonder sometimes if some people think I'm weird, because I am going out of my way on the sidewalk to say hello to unknown people of color, or or I'm walking down the street, hi, and they're like, who is that crazy old lady? But at the same time, you have to couple that and be aware of your own situation. Carol's a little tiny thing, and if I'm sorry, Carol.
She's pretty fierce though.
I have a little tiny dog, and I know how that goes. But as women, we are taught that too. To be fearful, to be vigilant, to be on guard when we are out and about. And how much of that is just, you're implying that on patriarchy? I don't know. But women.
Part of it.
We tell your women not to wear your short skirts, tell your women not to walk down the street at night. No, hey guys, just stop doing what you're doing. So yeah, there are a lot of things going into what Carol said. That was a really deep story that, at first, yes, she made eye contact and greeted him and, namaste, my soul greets her, so all that, which was really nice, but yeah. And I was like, okay, no, but I am on my way to do something and questioning why. So no, I really appreciate that, Carol. There's a lot in there.
Anything that you guys discussed at your table that you want to share?
Well, Mary Lee and I had shared some kind of similar stories of when we were younger, and she is from Cedar Rapids. I grew up in a small town by Waterloo, Iowa, when we would go, you know, shopping, or need to get something in a bigger city, we'd go to Waterloo, and both of us had the experiences of if we were driving through certain parts of these respective cities, our parents would say, lock your doors, we're driving through East Waterloo right now, you don't know what's gonna happen. And Marilee had the same experience with certain parts of
The
Cedar
neighborhood I
Rapids.
live in now.
So,
Another thing is my dad worked at John Deere in Waterloo and worked with what I'm sure is mostly white people. And there were a few people of color he worked with, and I remember, like, he would talk about work at home, and he would make these comments like, well, this guy, and I forget his name, for a black guy, he does a pretty good job, you know, like, these really not so veiled, backhanded sort of compliments that were pointing out that he wouldn't expect somebody to do a very good job because of the color of their skin.
so the kind,
That's what I drew up hearing.
so the
You're
kind,
exceptional.
so the kind of things you're referring to are the same things those of us who are white have experienced as we grew up, especially in Iowa, which does not have much diversity. We've heard those messages from our parents, from our relatives, from people growing up. We've heard those messages through the media. So it makes it really important for us to do that reflection piece, like Carol, you mentioned, where you were really self-examining your reaction to your thoughts and, you know, what would I have done in this situation? So it's really important for us to really do that self-reflection and check ourselves. What's the root motive here? What's causing that, whatever instinct it is to come out, and then do I need to reword that message that's coming up? Because we're all, based on our experiences, we're all gonna have those primal reactions that based on what we've heard and what we've experienced. But that doesn't mean we have to believe those, and it doesn't mean we have to act on those. We can re-examine those.
Ignorance line if you're recovering racist, that it's a daily ongoing process of unlearning what we had bred into us growing up.
Okay, so which tables had disbelieving people of color, or experiences? Just one table. Okay, so I'll read that, for those of you who didn't have it. So, invalidating or disbelieving experiences of people of color. When people of color claim they have been affected by racism, many white people will immediately balk, saying, "Prove it," and prove it to my white sensibilities. Other whites may claim, "I don't think that's racism," or "That's never happened to me." People of color have survived. People of color have survived because we recognize what racism is and how to navigate a system undergirded by racism. In this, people of color are the experts. A function of systemic racism is that it is often invisible to white people, in part because the entertainment and news media, educational systems, political and moral ideologies, even the church, are all based on the belief that white options, white experiences, and white definitions are primary and true. White people are best in resisting and dismantling racism when they listen to, learn from, and assume the veracity of people of color. So, you guys share some of what you talked about?
Yeah, actually, I don't know if it was Donna and Norm or the Ices that, last weekend suggested we watch the Colin Kaepernick story. And Tom and I did. It's about 6 episodes, I think, about 30 minutes long each.
Is that on PBS, or where did you find that?
It was on Netflix for us.
Oh, on Netflix, okay.
And so we watched it, and one of the episodes that really sticks out in my mind
baseball tournaments, you know, they're weekends and they're out of town, and so painstakingly had his, and back up, he was adopted by a white couple. And I think he came from Wisconsin. And this, the parents now live in Turlock, California, up near, and his tournaments were in like, Bakersfield, Lancaster, and kind of out in the desert area. So his parents had a minivan, and they took him to all these tournaments every weekend. They checked into hotels, and he was not always with his parents in the lobby. And so, and it showed that people that worked at this hotel would like look at him and watch him and think he was a vagrant in there, you know, asking people for money. And he was like totally picked out of this whole bunch of people in the lobby, that these people that worked in the hotels, you know, sought him out and stared at him and watched his every move and wouldn't let him take an apple from, you know, that everybody else showed that they were taking these apples, and this lady was like looking at him. So anyway, it was, and his parents are like, they're not nearby, but they aren't really paying attention to this. So when they're facing, they're watching this, they're kind of oblivious to this being, you know, directed at their son. And they didn't go in and step in and really just kind of like come off the wall at people. But then after 3 weekends, the 4th weekend, he's getting his permit, and his dad lets him drive the minivan. And the police stop him, and not for speeding, but because, you know, he's driving while black. Yeah, and so the police officer, you know, looks in and looks at his parent, or well, he doesn't know they're his parents, and looks in and says to, you know, his parents, "Are you guys all right?"
Oh, you're kidding.
That makes me wanna take a knee right now.
Yeah, he's a young teenager,
Oh,
and
gee.
so he's driving his minivan with his parents in there, and he got stopped just because of that. And his parents goes, "Yes, we're all right because we're his parents." And so anyway, so then he has to show his driver's license, and he goes like that, and the cop's like backing up, like, wait a minute, you know, and just.
Even after they said that they were his
Well,
parents?
I think that was before, you know, and he's still kind of not sure what is this scene in front of him. It doesn't give him a ticket, and he goes, "Well, slow down." So, you know, in the future or something like that. And this poor kid, Colin, was just shaking. And I would have just gotten out of the car and just said, "I can't drive," so, you know, he was that shaken up.
Was anything said about the parents giving him the talk?
I don't recall his parents giving him the talk. So I don't know if they just thought he's one of us and we don't need to, have that talk, but
I don't know about you, but I had the talk.
But, anyway, it was just, and I have not really personally experienced being with people that I thought, that I'm looking back on, maybe it happened and I just was oblivious. So I think I'm going to be more aware of what is, and it's not really even the words, it was the actions of people. You know, scaring him wherever he went, and, you know, not letting him get a second cup of ice cream, and his friend, his white friend clearly got 2 and 3, and they wouldn't allow him to have a second, so it's,
And I think it's just a crime how he continues to be vilified for taking a knee during the national anthem.
yeah, and so people that are.
Even after events that have taken place since then, he's still vilified as this horrible
Yeah.
person. And, you know, and no NFL team has the guts to, you know, to give him a job, and I think it's just, and people were complaining, you know, after the George Floyd riot, or during the George Floyd riots, well, you know, you should be peaceful demonstrating. Well, he tried peaceful demonstration, and that wasn't acceptable either, so,
Yeah, he wasn't good enough, so he stood
yeah,
up.
yeah.
We
we probably didn't get as far as you did, but.
Hey, Tony, you wanna take your mask off while you're?
Oh, sorry. I noticed with the, we just started watching it, we didn't get as far as you did, but I noticed with the episode is hair, they kind of were just, they didn't get it.
Oh, yeah, that was another thing in here.
It was more about like, it looks bad versus like, we have a black kid and his hair is different. They were just like, no, that's not professional, you know? It's, so they, I get that from the beginning, his parents are kind of like, no, you're just gonna assimilate and, you know, and like you said, they probably thought he was one of them. And then they see that he's not.
Yes, Mike?
I think the challenge for us as white folks is,
You wanna do your mask off?
okay,
It's
it's
easier,
not just
it's easier when people are talking.
that, you know, that we see a story like that on Netflix with somebody who's prominent and famous. But then also to hear that same story from a black 13-year-old boy or his black parents, and they're telling that story with a little bit of passion in their own style of explaining it, and to just sit back and listen and accept as their personal truth and their experience what happened.
Mhm.
And even if it sounds different, even if it has a little bit of passion behind it, which of course it would, you know, would you be a passionate parent telling that story and just go in teachable with an open mind and heart to just listen to their experience. Yeah.
Anything else you guys wanna add? Don't have to, but just checking. Good, okay. So the last one is denying white privilege. Thank you. So, in her groundbreaking essay, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, educator and activist Peggy McIntosh describes white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets which I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious and unconscious, so not aware. Specifically, white privilege are advantages that white people enjoy that are generally not extended to the same extent to people of color. Even for the white people who battle systems of racism, McIntosh says, white skin opens many doors for whites, whether or not we approve of such practices. Common examples, white people are seldom asked to speak for or represent their race. White Christians can visit most U.S. churches and find Jesus and biblical characters portrayed as white. White children can count on school curricula celebrating heroes and heroines from their racial group. White people can remain oblivious to the language and customs of people of color without feeling any loss or penalty because of that lack of knowledge. One positive aspect of white privilege is that when white people speak and act against racial injustice, it often receives more attention and respect from other white people in power. So, you guys, this table and that back table had it, so do you guys want to start with sharing some of the things you talked about?
I talked maybe the most. I've been aware myself of white privilege for about, at least for 35 years. I think that was about the time that was starting to be formulated as a theory, but it's been around forever. It came to me, as many of you are aware, I walked all the streets of Cedar Rapids, Marion, and Hiawatha. And when I was doing that project, that took me into all kinds of neighborhoods, many of them very white, and a few of them very black. And never was bothered much of anything, much at all. And when the subject of white privilege came up, I thought, oh, I would have been in a much more, I would have had the police call me a lot if I were black and trying to do the same project. And while I was doing that, there was one day that I happened upon a black teenager who was looking for his aunt's place, and he was in southwest Cedar Rapids, Sixth Avenue, 29th Street, you gotta go this way, and, I'm not sure you're gonna find anything there, but, just always wondered whatever happened to the kid. We also got into talking about, especially among poor whites, that you might have a, more, because they haven't received a lot of the benefits of white society either, at least they may not perceive that. Certainly struggling along. And so the idea that, my skin confers on me certain privileges, that may be a harder one for them to accept. At least to be able to counter it with personal experiences. And I think back to my childhood when Italians were looked upon, down upon. They're gangsters, all of them, and how they were sort of on the bottom of the rungs of the white ladder. And so if you're at the bottom rung, it's hard to look down from there. Any other things?
Tell us the major stuff, unless the Minneapolis thing.
Oh, yeah. I lived in North Minneapolis, which is where the first black ghetto area was in Minneapolis. And I had friends who lived over in that area, white people. And one of them was burglarized and they called the police. And rather than giving them help, they were basically rated, well, the solution, move out of here. Lots of help that was. Serve and protect.
Thank you. Back table, what are some parts of your conversation that you would like to share with the group?
Well, I think we talk about some of the same things, and, when we talk about privilege, I might hear that word privilege and go, well, I'm not privileged. I hear privilege as, I have a rec room with a pool table in the basement, I have an RV in my driveway. I don't have that kind of privilege. I make $13.75 at KFC or whatever. I'm not privileged. But the privilege is that you have the privilege of not having barriers. As white Americans, we have the privilege to not have those barriers. And there was a podcast I was listening to recently, and they compared this whole thing to cell phone. That this whole system, all set up of white supremacy, that there's these stratas. It's like if it's the cell phone, I'm not even aware, I use my cell phone so much, and I have a smartphone, I'm not even aware of how the technology works, it's all invisible to me. I have no idea how much it's benefiting me. I'm not even aware that there's other people who only have landlines and flip phones. And I'm also not the one who can be the one to dismantle my use of this because I depend upon it so much. And I'm not even aware of how much I depend upon it. And that really kind of spun my mind around a lot, that comparison. It was a really brilliant analogy on that podcast. But it can be that invisible to us. And that idea too that I think is really important at the end of what we read, that one of the positives of it is that as white people, if we speak out against something, if we bring up something, right or wrong, we might be listened to more. And so what does that say? Speak out and say something. Even if it's hard, say something. And I think also one of the negatives of that positive is if we speak out and say stuff, as we have in recent years and as things have come up, then we start to see state legislatures saying, whoa, wait a minute, we can't teach that, we can't talk about that, look, we passed a law. So there's backlash to it too, so it's kind of scary. But
we have to continue to.
yeah, but the whole thing, back to circle around what it says, denying white privilege that that's the microaggression. To deny that there is a privilege of not having to deal with those certain barriers is the microaggression.
All right, thank you. So, probably not gonna be able to show all the ones today that I wanted to, but I've got a couple of videos that I wanted to show. So this one, a few of us from St. Stephen's attended during the summer, a rally that the Marion Alliance for Racial Equity put on, and it was at Resurrection Lutheran in Marion. And this is, so they, one of the things I really appreciated about this event was that they had several Linn-Mar minority students share their experiences and talk at this event. And so this is like one example of how we can listen to the experiences of people of color, and then kind of think about, okay, what are some things that I can do differently where I'm not doing these, being a part of these microaggressions. So this young woman happens to be Hispanic.
Color. I've not seen much diversity, therefore I felt like I just found my place with the white crowd. So I really appreciate clubs like Aloe, Roots, and the Social Justice Club, so I can interact, feel included, and talk to people like me. I experienced racism with my sister and I. We would be on our way back home on the bus, and we would be surrounded by kids saying racist and stereotypical things to us and the other kids of color on the bus. The bus driver would hear these comments and choose to do nothing about it. But when a person of color said or did something similar, the bus driver would immediately call it out and do something about it. How is this fair? Shouldn't all children be treated equally? My curiosity about equity made me want to research more about the data of the Linn-Mar student to staff diversity. Data in the Linn-Mar School District says that the student body is made up of 80% white, 8% Asian, 8% Black or African American, 3% Latino or Hispanic, and 0.3% other non-white. Throughout my time at Linn-Mar, I've only had one Black teacher in middle school and one Black teacher in high school. I wonder if this has been the same representation in teaching staff my peers have seen in school as well. So I looked at the data of the staff at the school district and found no racial or ethnic diversity. Of the 32 staff identified as assistant principals, administrators, and managers, I found not a single person of color. In elementary, secondary, other classroom teachers, and guidance counselors, 8 out of the 549 staff were identified as people of color. Only 8. Shouldn't our teaching staff be as diverse as our student population? Yes. Why isn't it more diverse? This is why it is important to listen to the voices of people of color when they do speak up, and not just when it's convenient or when it's a crisis. I think this impacts all white and students of color when we don't experience the richness of diversity that would create more impactful learning, dialogue, and action towards equitable and more inclusive education and personal engagement. This also applies to our community and community.
So, a good example here of the fear of people of color. She talked about our experience on the bus. White students would act up, the bus driver would do nothing, but if Black students did, then they would be disciplined. And this is in Linn-Mar, in Marion, Iowa. Huge school district, very, very minimal staff, people of color or minority representation on the staff. So really big issue, and that's where we can help get involved when we're part of organizations or part of school districts and really start asking some of these questions. Why don't we have a more diverse staff? And really advocate for those kinds of things. And that's part of the listening and then taking action. This one is related to white privilege. This is my favorite gal from MTV that we saw one of her videos before. She has a really neat way of saying things.
When it comes to social justice, there's one word that can stop almost any conversation dead in its tracks: privilege. If you've ever stumbled into a conversation about racism, you've probably heard the phrase white privilege, which has been ruffling feathers since the phrase became commonplace in the 1960s. The concept of privilege isn't limited to race, but when it's brought up, no matter who you're talking to, too often the response isn't very friendly. Privilege? How dare you? So what exactly is privilege, and why does talking about it make so many people so angry? Privilege is defined as a special right or advantage available only to a particular person or group of people. In the context of social inequality, it means that some groups of people are treated better than others based on their race, gender, class, sexuality, or physical ability. Now, here's the thing about privilege. Everyone has it. You've got privilege! You've got privilege! We've all got privilege! So, for example, as an able-bodied person, I've never struggled to find a bathroom that I can comfortably access, or gone out to lunch with friends to only realize that I can't find a parking spot to get into the restaurant, or even fit through the door. When I turn on my favorite show, I can watch and enjoy with ease because I don't require captions or descriptive narration, which too many shows don't have. So why does talking about privilege make some people angry? I think there are a number of reasons why privilege can be difficult to talk about. Number one, when people hear the word privilege, it feels like they're being blamed. When we use privilege in everyday conversations, we hear phrases like, X is a privilege, not a right. So the vocabulary makes it seem like it's something that you don't deserve. Combine that with the fact that conversations about social inequality tend to be very passionate, it's easy to understand why someone might be upset when check your privilege comes up. No one wants to be the bad guy, and for some people, the concept of privilege feels like they're being blamed for something that's out of their control. And when you think about it that way, sure, that's bound to make someone angry. Number two, privilege makes people feel guilty. Talking about privilege is not meant to make you feel guilty. Guilt isn't productive. Acknowledging it isn't about shame, it's about challenging the system that perpetuates inequality. The existence of privilege isn't my fault or your fault, but understanding and acknowledging it is an important first step in working to make a world where these obstacles don't exist. However, ignoring the problem or refusing to acknowledge the problem exists just allows it to continue and thrive. Number three, anger is a defense mechanism. For some people, talking about privilege feels like they're being attacked, or worse yet, that their privilege is going to be taken away. In reality, privilege describes things that everyone should experience. For example, as a straight person, I don't encounter people passing judgment when I'm affectionate with my husband in public. That's not a bad thing. It should be that way for everyone, no matter their sexual orientation. Number four, they just don't understand privilege. The thing about privilege is it's kind of hard to see. It's like when a horse has those blinders on. They can see what's in front of them, but there's a whole bunch of stuff in the peripheral that they can't see. As wonderful as it would be for everyone to be treated fairly and equal no matter who they are, that's just not the world we live in. Privilege doesn't mean you're rich, a bad person, have had everything handed to you, or have never had challenges or struggles. It just means that there are some challenges and struggles that you won't experience because of who you are. So when you've lived your whole life with something, it's hard to understand what it's like for those without. Now, it's impossible for me to guarantee that every time privilege is brought up, it's justified, or that everyone talks about these issues in a responsible way that's free of name-calling or personal attacks. And unfortunately, if you've ever had a particularly nasty encounter that included the word privilege, then you might be turned off forever. But if you want to support equality for everyone, which I hope is why you're watching this show, it's important to remember that these conversations are inherently tough but necessary. And the discomfort or anger you may feel when talking about or understanding or acknowledging your privilege pales in comparison to the oppression that those on the other side of the coin deal with every day. So have you ever had difficulty talking to someone about privilege? Or maybe you had trouble understanding it or even acknowledging it? Tell us about it in the comments below, and we'll see you next week right here on Decoded. In our last sketch, we revealed the secret training camp for social justice warriors. Here's what you had to say. You're right, Nick. There's nothing wrong with poking fun at yourself.
Okay, so about time for late church to start, if second church service to start. So apologize for keeping you right up to the last minute. Really appreciate you turning out today and for your open and honest discussion and sharing. Hope to see you next week for the final segment.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Welcome.